This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The immigration debate has lasted decades, and for more than 30 years, it's pretty much gone nowhere. When I was a reporter in the 1980s, the conversation was about amnesty, what to do with the millions who came to this country illegally and wanted to stay. But things really heated up in the 90s, when the hunger for labor didn't line up with the supply of workers, and the U.S. was a big, blinking, help-wanted sign seen all around the world. Tijuana, Laredo, Brownsville, these are the new border battlegrounds in the modern political landscape. And tens of thousands of migrants, many that claim they're facing extreme violence in their home countries, are the pawns in this game. But there have been periods when the U.S. willingly offered a pathway to citizenship for people in danger, like immigrants fleeing genocide back home. From 1975 to 1979, as many as 3 million people were killed by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So in the early 80s, the United States accepted tens of thousands of Cambodians. Those refugees landed in America searching for safety and hoping to erase their memory of war. Some of those who made it onto American soil years later were too young to remember the place they left. Our producer Mateo Schimpf brings us the story of a man forced to face a home he never knew.
Phoeun was born in Cambodia in 1975. In April of that year, the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh and began systematically killing Cambodian citizens. His family fled the violence in 1976 when he was just a year old.
We fled to Thailand, and we ended up staying in Thailand for 4 years, awaiting somebody from the U.S. to pick us up and help us out, start a new life.
After the Vietnam War's disastrous end, the U.S. State Department was totally unprepared for the number of refugees that would arrive here from Southeast Asia. As a result, religious organizations stepped in to help find places for people to stay. Phoeun and his family, they were some of those people. After 4 years of waiting in Thailand, they got hooked up with a Mormon family that lived about 40 miles north of Salt Lake City, Utah.
They had a big house, and this was the first time I experienced snow. I'm like, wow, I'm gonna freeze to death.
After a few years in Utah, Phoeun's parents decided to move the family to California. Long Beach, where they eventually ended up, is home to the largest population of Cambodians outside of Cambodia. The move gave his family a chance to reconnect with their roots, really, for the first time since they arrived in the U.S. But life in Long Beach was tough.
It felt like it was at least 12 people in the house all the time. At least. Like a 3-bedroom, people scattered all over. I thought that was normal, though. I didn't know. That was just my upbringing.
Despite being around more kids that looked like him, Phoeun got bullied. He said school was pretty racially segregated, and kids from Black and Latino communities, they were territorial, especially as more students from Southeast Asia started showing up. So at 13, Phoeun joined his older brother's gang for protection, a group of other Cambodian guys who had his back. But ultimately, it's playing the role of protector that would change his life forever.
My nephew was having issues at school. He was saying that he was getting bullied and pushed around and harassed by Hispanic students. This is the exact thing I went through when I was growing up.
One day, Phoeun was picking up his nephew from school when they got jumped by another group of teenagers.
There was 6 of them. They got out the car, I got out the car, and my nephew got out the car. And there was a small riot that happened in the parking lot. We left really bruised and battered. Emotionally, it tore me up. I'm like, man, I'm here to protect my nephew. Instead, I allowed this to happen. So I left really, really angry and shocked. And I just started drinking when I got home.
He'd been drinking heavily at the time, and his life in general, it was kind of a mess.
I feel like in the times that we moved from Cambodia to Utah, California. It felt like a piece of me was left behind somewhere. I felt like I was a failure. I never found a place where I felt settled in. Each time I figured it out, I had to redo it all over again.
Phoeun was constantly reinventing himself. He'd put on one mask to blend in with his new surroundings, and then take it off, swap it out when he landed at his next spot. Behind those masks, he said, was a lot of hurt and shame. He was isolated, didn't know who he was. Phoeun was tired of trying to escape. First genocide, then bullies, and eventually his own self. So when he and his nephew got jumped in the parking lot, Phoeun saw an opportunity to finally stand his ground. The next day, Phoeun borrowed a shotgun from a friend. He'd never fired a shotgun before, and went out looking for the kids from the parking lot. He and his nephew drove around the neighborhood until they spotted a group walking home from school. Phoeun thought he recognized one of the kids from the brawl and told his nephew to slow down the car. Phoeun aimed out the window and fired into the crowd. It killed one of the kids and injured 4 others. Phoeun didn't stick around long. Later that night, he skipped Long Beach and drove to Vegas. That's where he got picked up by the police, brought back to Long Beach, and started his long journey through the criminal justice system. In 1996, and at just 20 years old, Phoeun was convicted of first-degree murder.
When the guilty verdict came, my gut feeling was like, man, I'm going to end up doing a lot of time and possibly never get out. I'm really going to die in prison.
At the sentencing hearing a few months later, the judge gave him 35 years to life.
My heart just froze. It momentarily stopped. I felt like I died inside somehow because I knew that it is a strong chance that I'll never make it home again. I felt like that was a death sentence, even though it was a life sentence.
Phoeun's first stop was Salinas Valley State Prison in California. It's about 50 miles inland from Monterey.
When I first walked on the yard, I was like, man, not only blown away, but fear set in. Just looking around, and it was barbed wires, and I felt like a small boy. It felt defeating, you know? Because now you're caged in like a fish in a fish bowl. It's like, what next?
The prison is a level 4 facility. That's the highest level of security in the state. And as a result, it's a pretty rough place.
I saw a lot of stabbings. And the funny thing is that you have to almost stop yourself from being human. When you see somebody bleeding after they just got stabbed, you just gotta almost like look the other way. Because every time you see blood or you see a human being hurting, the human side of me makes me want to care. Like, hey, man, I know this is prison, but man, are you okay? But I can't do that.
Phoeun was so focused on trying to survive that he didn't take time to reflect on the murder. But then something happened that would change the way Phoeun saw himself and the crime he committed.
So after I left Salinas Valley, I went to a level 3 yard. And I was in my cell, and every night there's mail. An officer came, slid the mail under my door, and I picked it up and read it. And it was a letter from my sister, an older sister, and said, hey, look, we have some news that your sister was murdered. A jealous boyfriend shot her in a parking lot and left her to die. And me just reading that, it just made me feel like somebody had punched me. And then I couldn't breathe. And my world just stopped. My whole body kind of went numbed. Who the hell would want to do this to a girl? Let alone my sister, my family. I'm sad about her life. I'm sad about what she left behind. I'm sad for my sisters, my other sisters, and my parents. I'm sad for myself Because now for sure I'm never going to see her again. I probably lived like that for a week after hearing that news. And after a week, it dawned on me that this must be how the victim's family must have felt when I took their son away from them. It was pivotal that it kind of almost changed my outlook on life, really opened my eyes. It planted a seed of compassion and empathy. I don't want to do this to anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody again.
The thought of change presented a big problem for Phoeun. He didn't actually know who he was. Since the day his family fled Cambodia, he'd been like a chameleon, camouflaging himself to hide the trauma of war. It was the only way for him to really blend into harsh new environments. But losing his sister, it forced Phoeun to take a long, hard look in the mirror. And I don't think he liked what he saw.
I still feel like I'm not going home. I still feel like I'm going to die in prison. And now I'm carrying this other weight of what happened to my sister, and it makes me feel like, what else is there in life to look forward to? What can I do to find purpose and meaning again?
After 6 years in Soledad State Prison, that's the name of the level 3 yard, Phoeun was transferred to San Quentin. It's the prison just a few miles north of San Francisco. It's notorious for housing some of California's most violent offenders, but also for having one of the state's most innovative rehabilitation programs. When Phoeun signed up for an intensive re-education group called Vogue, memories resurfaced that he tried to bury decades ago.
Just really talking about my crime the first time. Not understanding the magnitude of what I've done exactly. Understand it and really wanted to heal from all the traumatic events that led up to this. All the way from leaving a country where war happened. What happened to me as a result? What happened at home? Why didn't I feel connected and loved?
Those were painful questions for Phoeun to grapple with. He was responsible for killing another person. For years, Phoeun worked hard to keep the ghosts at bay. But the rehabilitation program changed that.
It was liberating, it was confusing, and it also hurts. I now see things like, hey, that was the voice you took on, that was the narrative you took on at that time. Do you really see that as true now?
Throughout the rehabilitation process, Phoeun saw how intergenerational trauma contorted the lives of other refugees like him. Because of the Cambodian genocide, he bounced from Thailand to Utah to Long Beach, and eventually to prison. So after finishing Vogue, Phoeun started a program for other AAPI inmates called Roots. They talk about history and war, but also about what comes next, about how to enter back into society. Then in 2015, he received his associate's degree. Phoeun invited his parents to the graduation. It had been 20 years since he had seen them.
It's probably one of my proudest moments. There's a piece of joy and sadness. They became elderly in front of my eyes. Reality just hits. Like it or not, time keeps moving. You gotta move with it, or else things are just gonna pass by and then you're left with regret.
In 2021, Phoeun came up for a parole board hearing. To be found suitable, he had to convince the board's commissioner that he was remorseful and understood the, quote, nature and magnitude of the offense. That might not sound like much, but it's a really tough standard to meet. At the time of his hearing, the COVID-19 pandemic was still raging. So Phoeun learned whether he'd be free through a video call.
It was intimidating. They called me back in, and I sit there and wait for them to speak. Usually the DA from your county, the place where you committed the offense, usually they will oppose. And then it goes back to the commissioner for him to say what he feels should happen. And then as he was speaking, at this point, I'm almost kind of numbed. Can't really absorb exactly all the words he was saying because it sounds kind of good, but we're not 100% sure until it gets to the end. It says, yeah, we find you suitable for parole.
If you're imagining what that moment might have felt like for Phoeun, emotional, liberating, Phoeun actually describes it as a sort of daze. He still felt a sense of guilt, tugging away at his conscience.
It also feels in a way, man, if I feel joy, it takes away from the crime I've committed. Here I am given a second chance where a life was lost by my hands and he will never have a second chance.
It took 150 days for the release process to play out. After Phoeun was approved by the parole board, his case went to Governor Gavin Newsom's office for sign-off. The whole time, Phoeun wondered, when is this going to happen? And some days even, is this going to happen at all? And then, a few days before he was set to be released, Phoeun got a visit from a U.S. immigration official.
An ICE agent comes and calls me out my cell. He goes, hey, you have an ICE hold. You're not going to walk out of here. Instead, we will transfer you from here to an ICE facility to fight your deportation case.
This is what's happening at the center of Phoeun's case, what people fighting on his behalf would call double punishment. Shortly after arriving to the U.S. as refugees from Cambodia, his family received their green cards. When Phoeun turned 18, he became eligible for citizenship. The legal terms here, they can get a bit confusing, but he'd spent enough time in this country as a lawful permanent resident to become a citizen. With so much happening at home, though, that fell down the list of priorities. The neighborhood was violent. Food wasn't always on the table, and their house, it was overflowing with people. So by the time his family members started the process to become citizens, Phoeun was already in prison. His conviction revoked his status as a green card holder. And regardless, there's a law that bans people convicted of any aggravated felony after 1990 from becoming citizens. That, of course, includes first-degree murder. So instead, ICE placed a hold on him. Essentially a bookmark in his immigration case saying if and when you're released from state prison, we'll come find you. Now, that day had come. In the eyes of the law, even after years of rehabilitation and being granted parole, Phoeun was undeserving of staying in the place he called home.
And I left prison again. The numbness never really went away. I felt like I was served another life sentence.
In December 2021, ICE agents processed Phoeun in San Francisco before taking him to an ICE facility in Central California.
I'm sitting there wondering my fate, waiting for deportation to happen almost. Like, now what? When I do leave, what happens? I have no ties to a country I was born in. I left when I was 1 year old and don't speak the language, don't know anybody.
His impending deportation, it didn't actually come as a surprise. He'd watched dozens of inmates from places like Guatemala and Honduras go through the same process. Released from prison one day and picked up by ICE the next. Regardless, once they ended up in a detention facility, they had to decide whether or not to fight their case. As you might imagine, the lawyer fees to do this can be expensive. But more importantly, and hugely important for Phoeun, was the amount of time it would take. He said he met one guy who spent 5 years fighting his case from that ICE facility.
Pleading your case, you have to weigh it out. Like, does it matter when the law is already set in stone? Do you prolong your sentence and your stay if you know you're going to lose the case anyways?
Did you ever think you had a shot to beat your deportation case?
That's hard to say because I didn't give it the time to fight. I didn't give myself that opportunity. I'm in the ICE detention center on the phone with a friend. And an officer asked me, hey, are you this person? I go, yeah. Once you get off the phone, report to the podium and bag up your belongings. And that's all he said. Oh, my heart just started pounding. I'm like, this is it. This is the moment they're gonna take me. So I hung up the phone and an ICE agent came and he's the one who said, hey, you're headed to the airport. I was like, damn. They are shipping me now. I couldn't call anybody.
Phoeun made repeated requests to call his lawyer, to tell her that he was, in fact, being deported. And today. But Phoeun was never allowed to make that phone call. Instead, he was told to pack his life belongings into a single backpack. From there, 3 ICE officers brought him to the airport in shackles.
I got off the airplane, got in a van, and went to a Cambodian immigration center. Went over there and got processed and did some fingerprints, took a few pictures, and they said, look, man, you're in a new country, you're starting fresh. Just think about it that way.
It was starting fresh for Phoeun. So fresh, in fact, that he had no idea what Phnom Penh even looked like.
I thought about Cambodia like, man, I'm going to see cows on the road, dirt roads and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Not knowing that, hey, that was 45 plus years ago. You was 1 year old.
Phoeun didn't have a job or speak Khmer. But more immediately, he was living in a sort of legal purgatory. He didn't have a passport, not from the US and not from Cambodia. And according to his lawyer, any documentation of his birth was destroyed in the genocide. He had immigration papers, but no proof that he was actually a citizen of any country. During his first week in Phnom Penh, Phoeun was alone. In need of company, friendship, and importantly, a Cambodian citizen to back his own application, Phoeun got a surprising call.
My aunt is my mom's youngest sister.
It had been nearly 50 years since Phoeun had seen or spoken to his aunt.
She spoke Cambodian and she spoke Thai. Thai was the language that my family used at home because we're part Thai.
Phoeun's Thai is pretty sharp. He still speaks it with his parents.
At first it was strange because I just landed. I'm thinking, man, I have nobody. But yeah, here's family from decades ago, ready to welcome me and receive me. That felt like no matter what, here's at least somebody that's going to look out for you for the time being.
With the help of his aunt, Phoeun is now a citizen of Cambodia, and she hooked him up with his new apartment in Phnom Penh. He's on the 3rd floor, just above a baby supply store with a green awning that stands out against the building's gray exterior. He starts his day at 5:30, with a cup of coffee and a George Strait record.
So in the corner of my living room, I have a table set up with my computer. That's where I spend my mornings checking for messages from friends or emails.
Even though he's free and living independently, Phoeun spends a lot of time in his apartment. Phoeun's Cambodian language skills, or Khmer, it's improving, but slowly. So Phoeun uses a translator app on his smartphone to get by, even for the simple tasks, like ordering at a restaurant. The language barrier has kept him from dating or making new friends.
I'm a social person. I want to mingle. I want to talk. I want to connect on a deeper level. And I don't have the words to do that. And it feels really awkward because I can't express fully.
Then there's the cultural disconnect. He still feels like an outsider in his parents' country, and it makes him self-conscious.
When I walk down the street, I can feel that I'm not in the US. There's no sidewalk. There's no street lamps. And the billboards, nothing's in English. Everything's in Cambodian or Chinese. Sometimes I ride around on my motorcycle and I get little stares. I ride a big bike and people are not used to that here. I get stares because they look at me and it's like, okay, the tattoos and the shaved head. They'll notice that my accent's a little off. So they get the hint, like, okay, this guy's not completely one of us.
Phoeun's been living in Cambodia since March of 2022. And pretty quickly, he needed to figure out how he'd support himself. He decided early on that teaching would be a good path.
I've been applying for jobs, sending out a lot of my resumes to different schools. And so far, things have been slow, but I'm hopeful and positive that something will come through.
He'd done it for adults at San Quentin, and he was good with people. It was a natural fit, and he felt like he had a decent shot at landing a gig.
I was applying for maybe a good 4 months. I think I applied for close to 20. I had maybe 4 interviews out of the 20. They kept getting no's and no's and no's, and I was like, man, what is going on?
Phoeun wasn't sure, but he had this sinking feeling that his criminal record in the US had followed him to Cambodia.
Usually they don't know right away unless I reveal it to them, and I try not to reveal it, but there's questioning. You can see the facial expression on the interviewer, like, hey, what are you doing in this country? You're still young. And then they'll try to piece it together without saying it.
Phoeun was applying to a number of international and private schools. He knew the more prestigious ones ran background checks, and that the international schools, some of which are accredited by American institutions, would have access to a U.S. criminal database.
Okay, students, good morning.
After months of rejection, Phoeun finally broke through, teaching English at an international school in Phnom Penh. Do you like it?
Yeah, I do. They fill me up with joy, man. It's kind of interesting because although I feel like I speak my English pretty well, teaching it is another thing.
When we talked a few months later, Phoeun was getting ready to grade final exams. He was exhausted. He teaches 5 grade levels, and he likes it, but says the hours were long and the wages low. But he feels like he has purpose again, and it's helping Phoeun make sense of his past.
For my higher grade, level 9 students, I gave them this project where I'm asking them, hey, I know that culturally it's difficult for the Cambodian community to communicate and get to know their parents. So your project is to do an interview with your parents. My goal for them is like, hey, if you get to know your parents better, you'll get to know your history a little bit better, who you are and where you came from.
One thing that always stood out to me when Phoeun described why he committed his crime was that he didn't feel love and connection at home. Maybe through teaching, Phoeun is trying to connect with a younger version of himself.
I think of my own past. Growing up, I was living my life. I didn't know my parents enough. It wasn't until I went through the struggles that I really wanted to reconnect.
Phoeun is still grappling with what his second chance means. Returning to Cambodia, it's not a clean slate, and it never was. Phoeun says that in America, he wasn't American enough. Now that he's in Cambodia, he feels like he's not Cambodian enough. And his criminal conviction will be something he has to navigate for the rest of his life.
It's like having a tattoo. It will always be attached to that. My situation has changed quite a bit. I've made a mental commitment to myself to try my best to detach from the 2 worlds I was living in. I was stuck. My heart was in the U.S. My family, my friends was in the U.S. I wanted to be home so bad. And now I'm accepting my reality is that you're here now. You have to adjust and start living again. Stop living in 2 worlds.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Mateo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Phoeun You is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.